newer. Click the little, got it. Online social environments are much newer than other sorts of social environments. And I think in some ways this makes them more fragile because all of us are still sort of determining how social norms apply, how we're going to detect oppression, how we're going to resist oppression. And then the other thing is just a quick reminder that social environments, when they are online, are still real and still matter. I know people sometimes talk about like online versus real life, but of course that's not the case when we're talking about social interactions. Since 2000, the average number of hours that an American spends online per week has risen from 9 hours a week to 24 hours a week. And this statistic is from 2018, so that's pre-pandemic. So it's probably only gone up since then. And when polled, about 62% of people said that online environments and interactions were important for maintaining their social relationships. So I do think that there are real stakes here. And what I'm going to argue is that we should be especially concerned about this because oppression functions in novel ways online. So oppression doesn't function the same way we might expect it to in offline environments, but actually has new mechanisms. I'm trying to argue for a difference in kind, not just a difference in degree. And so this matters because if oppression is functioning differently, one, it's going to be harder to recognize, and two, it means society is going to have fewer tools to combat those oppressive forces in the online environment. So I'm making two assumptions kind of before I get started with my examples. One assumption is that we should pursue non-oppressive social environments. I'm just going to take that for granted that we have reasons to combat oppression in all of our social environments. And then number two is I'm going to use Iris Marion Young's account of oppression. I think it's really helpful. If you're unfamiliar, she's going to define oppression as, and when I say oppression, I mean a kind of injustice. And she says oppression functions by restricting its victim's agency. So one's capacity for doing things in society is restricted because of a membership in social group. So your social group identity is what's restricting your agency in society. Iris Marion Young also talks about 5 faces of oppression, 5 forms that it can take. Those are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence. So what I'm going to do in this talk is primarily just give 3 examples, and they're going to focus on 3 of these 5 faces as ways that oppression is functioning differently in an online social environment as compared to a social environment we might already be familiar with. So I'm going to talk about gendered marginalization, I'm going to talk about cultural imperialism and white supremacy, and I'm going to talk about children and powerlessness. So that's the preview of what we're doing, why oppression is different, how it could be functioning differently online. Excuse me. So first, gendered marginalization. Okay, what is marginalization? As it sounds like, it's about being pushed to the margins, people being excluded from a certain social activity. So Young talks about this primarily in terms of economic or political spheres. People are marginalized when it's harder for them to participate in a certain activity. So you could think of this as like blocked participation. And so gender can function this way, where society structures are primarily built to focus on the concerns of men. And so gendered concerns and women's concerns can be pushed to the margins. Excuse me. So one example of this would be like the way that our systems of law enforcement and police deal with like gendered violence, like domestic violence, or even reports of sexual assault. There's plenty of stories out there about people not being taken as seriously or feeling like those sorts of assaults or instances of violence are not treated as the central goal or as significant by our law enforcement systems. So this sort of exclusion of like, oh yeah, that stuff's peripheral, it's not central. That would be characteristic of, I think, the standard definition of marginalization. But what's happening online that is different is we're moving from just sort of exclusion to really a sort of erasure is what I'm arguing. And so rather than these concerns just being marginalized, they're really rendered invisible in some ways by authority structures. The example I want to consider is the case of women receiving online threats. So these can be any sort of generalized sexual harassment or threats online, along with death threats and rape threats. So there's a couple of different ways that I think we are not properly dealing with this form of oppression in online social environments. One is a lot of the discussion of online threats don't acknowledge their gendered nature. So women are much more likely to receive threats online. And of course, women are much more likely to receive threats that specifically focus on gender. So focus on, for example, threats of sexual assault. The other thing that society isn't really focusing on is the fact that these types of online abuse and threats seems to be increasing. If we look at severe threats, so not just kind of everyday harassment and threats, but threats of physical harm, threats of sexual assault, or kind of extended stalking and threats that take place online, the incidence of people receiving those threats from 2015 to 21 has gone from 15% to 25%. So this is a substantial increase, and receiving these types of threats can be really impactful on the women who are impacted by this. And you can see this in the proportion of women who say they've experienced online harassment, abuse, and threats, which is about a quarter of women. And if you ask women, how is law enforcement or the government or police responding to online threats? Women are much more likely to say than men that the responses are inadequate. So we've got this concern that this isn't really being dealt with. But what I think is different here from just the usual exclusion and makes it count as erasure is the phenomenon is sort of being treated as if it's not relevant at all to law enforcement, as if it's not, it's sort of not even treated as a threat or as harassment, right? So there's this way in which it's being defined out, like, oh, but that just happened online, right? That was just an online thing. Now, in theory, there's no difference between receiving a threat online and receiving a threat in person. The badness of the threat is that a threat was made against you. It shouldn't matter which social environment it occurred in. And yet we find that in online social environments, it's much more likely, both for kind of people listening to the story, but also critically for authority systems to not take it as seriously. And so that's a way of sort of defining out this phenomenon as like, well, that's not really a threat, this is a threat, right? And that sort of erasure and rendering invisible is what I'm really worried about. So there's kind of two ways that police might respond differently to online harassment, and there's been some research on this, that police officers are more likely to see online incidents as less serious and more easily avoidable. As I said, the less serious is troubling because the nature of a threat shouldn't in principle be different in an online environment than in person. But the fact that they see it as more easily avoidable is also really troubling. This is sort of a form of victim blaming, of essentially like, you should have taken actions to avoid this. And it's a way of defining this as something that does not concern law enforcement, that authorities don't need to get involved in, if in fact it's something that the onus was on the victim to avoid this situation. So that's what I mean when I'm saying it's being rendered invisible. It's not, it doesn't count as abuse, it doesn't count as harassment. Instead, it's something that the individual ought to avoid, and it doesn't fall within the purview of our existing authority structures. And that's really problematic. So one more example, there was a journalist from Slate who was receiving violent threats on Twitter and went to law enforcement because she was receiving these violent threats. And the police officer asked her, "What is Twitter?" So that's kind of just funny, but unfortunate that they don't know kind of the basics of our online social environment. What's more troubling is the advice that she received was just don't go on Twitter. And that's what I mean by focusing on the victim as like, it's your job to just avoid these environments. But of course, that's completely unacceptable. She's a journalist. She needs to be able to access our social spaces, including our online social spaces. And we can't just ignore the fact that abuse and threats are occurring. So thinking about this example of gendered marginalization, I'm arguing rather than the usual exclusion, we actually have straight up erasure happening, where we're not naming abuse as abuse. We're not naming threats as threats. And gendered violence is not being treated as within the purview of our authority structures. So what does this mean for combating oppression online? Briefly, I think it means we need to spend more time working on telling the truth and being really accurate with how we portray online social environments, including like call things what they are, right? Call gendered abuse, gendered abuse. Okay, so my second example is I want to talk about cultural imperialism and white supremacy. Cultural imperialism, Young says, is sort of the universalization of a dominant group's experience within a culture. So it means that within a given culture, there's going to be sort of a default perspective. An example of this would be like in offline social environments, everyone can sort of interpret and communicate within the bounds of white culture. People are very familiar with it. Even if you're not white, you sort of have to learn how it works, how to interpret it, how to communicate within it. And this is not the case for, all other sorts of subcultures within our society. It's sort of treated as the default. And so there's this pre-existing sort of permissiveness of everyone has to understand where white supremacy is coming from and what white culture is like. So there's a difference between if someone posts angrily on social media and they're white, you're like, well, maybe they're just an angry conservative. Whereas if someone posts on social media and they're brown, maybe as a society, we're more likely to say, this is a threat, this is unacceptable, this is dangerous. So there's this sort of permissiveness. But what I think is distinct here and why it's a different form of oppression is we also have this radical sort of what I'm calling passivity, like passiveness in the face of white supremacy online, where our social environments, people are really resistant to sort of wanting to name this cultural norm or wanting to try to do anything about it. So what I mean by this is everyone who posts in online social environments has to do so through some sort of host. There are online tech companies, right? Whether it's Facebook or TikTok or whether it's Google, there's places that people are hosted when they produce speech online. And so when they produce hate speech, there are tech companies that are facilitating that speech, okay? But what's different in online social environments versus offline social environments is there seems to be this disconnect in responsibility. And this sort of unwillingness to set standards. So we've seen that tech companies have sort of a lack of commitment to oversight of their platforms and to restricting hate speech. Hate speech is unevenly policed based on the color of one's skin and who's posting the speech online. And we've seen, there's actually even an EU report that tech companies have gotten slower at removing hate speech in the last couple of years. So the problem with all of this is the sort of superficial pretending to be committed to regulating hate speech, but then not really making any progress at it. And that's what I mean by passivity, this sort of throwing up of our hands and saying, well, what can we do about hate speech in an online environment? In addition, in online spaces, there are actually arguments explicitly against setting speech norms. So in offline spaces, most social environments, people sort of accept that, like, of course, you're going to set some standards for speech or some standards for behavior, whether you're in a classroom or you're at someone else's house. That's sort of the norm, is that your host might be able to set these standards. But in online environments, we've got some sort of extreme pro-free speech arguments that say, like, maybe we shouldn't even try. Maybe we shouldn't even try to regulate speech. Maybe we shouldn't be setting any boundaries. Maybe we shouldn't be doing any of these things. And I take it this is a significant problem because in the lack of trying to set any speech boundaries, then no boundaries get set. And so then this allows hate groups to flourish. There's been research at this point that online social media companies not only harbor hate groups, but they can also facilitate their recruitment and even allow them to profit, right? Facebook has helped white supremacist groups make money. And what's different about this with online spaces is, as I said, there's this passivity of like, well, we couldn't possibly be held responsible for the people that we're hosting. Whereas it's hard to imagine that happening in offline environments, right? If my university decided to rent out a room to a KKK group, right? And the KKK group was recruiting and flourishing because my university was giving them this room to use. People would be critical and would say, hey, why don't you have basic speech and behavioral boundaries for who you host, right? Or once you found out this was happening, why didn't you kick them out? There's this implicit responsibility here. Whereas in online spaces, for some reason, we've said, well, not we, tech companies have said, we couldn't possibly police these things. Again, there's this passivity. My final point with this is I think there's also this false perception of online spaces as neutral and colorblind. And I won't talk too much about this, but you can kind of see that with the forces of cultural imperialism, neutral spaces are going to end up being taken over by the forces that are dominant within a culture. And so it's not the case that we can just say, let's let everyone say whatever they want and it'll sort of balance out. That's not how it works. So thinking about cultural imperialism and white supremacy and hate speech online, we've got this real case of passivity of the powerful corporations that are acting as hosts to the people who are spreading this speech, kind of throwing up their hands and this sort of refusal to engage, which I think is a significant difference in kind from what we would see in offline social environments. Possible solutions here. I mean, the simplest solution is I think we have to set speech norms. There's not a way out of it. Yes, it's difficult to do. Yes, free speech is important, but we can't just give up and say we won't set any speech norms. We know that violent speech can lead later to violent actions. And so if we want to combat hate speech and white supremacist hate speech, we're going to need to set clear behavioral expectations for our online social environments. And if tech companies are not capable of doing that, perhaps we need government intervention, but we have to set some sort of standard there. Okay, so my last example is I want to talk about children and powerlessness. Powerlessness is a lack of power, as you may have guessed. Specifically thinking of a lack of power in decision-making. People who lack power are unable to control sort of the circumstances of their lives. Other people largely determine what their life is like. And I want to talk about children here, which is a little bit odd because children don't necessarily have fully developed agency, but I'm going to be assuming that children deserve at least some agency and some power within their own lives, even if they're not full adults. So offline, we can think of institutions and powerlessness as a form of oppression. So institutions would be oppressive if they, for example, were overly restrictive. So institutions that don't allow children to make any choices about their lives. Another way we could think about oppression and powerlessness or injustice is institutions are oppressive when they allow abuse of children or facilitate abuse of children because of the fact that abuse restricts a child's agency later on and is harmful to that child in terms of their capacity then to make choices about their future. So what's different about online environments is we have this distinct gap within our social structure. And sort of offline environments, when we're letting children be in social groups and get used to having some agency of their own, there's sort of always some sort of responsible adult or someone that fits within a supervisory role. Okay, so at home, maybe it's the parent or the guardian. At school, there's a teacher, right? Even when kids are out at recess or whatever, there's still some teacher that's in this supervisory role, not necessarily monitoring everything a child does. That's unreasonable, but at least in this kind of guardianship position, right? If a child goes to church, there's a religious leader. If they go to play soccer, there's a coach, okay? The idea is that there's someone who is in this guardian role and is responsible for the care of these children. Another way to think about this is if a child is abused, it's really clear whose fault it was. There's some adult who ought to have been noticing or ought to have been facilitating intervention. So someone distinctly failed if that occurs. What's significantly different about the online interaction is you have these social environments where children can function completely free of any supervision or any sort of guardianship. So if a child is sexually harassed online, whose fault is it? Who should have been overseeing them? We've now got this social environment where there's not even anyone in this sort of guardianship role. And kids are harassed online. If we look at girls, this is girls age 13 to 17, so minors, about a third of them say they've been sexually harassed online. And this intersects with other sorts of identities. So kids and teens who identify as LGBTQ are at increased risk for experiencing sexual harassment online. And so what's distinct about this is, again, there's no one whose job it is to monitor or check in, but more importantly, there's no one whose job it is for the kid to report to and get help from. I don't think it's appropriate to hold parents to this role. As I said, in offline environments, we see it's not always the parent that's in the guardianship role. There's other sorts of people. And I don't think it's realistic to expect parents to constantly monitor all of their kids' usage of online social environments. But I do think it looks like we need someone to be in a supervisory role. So if we're looking at this problem of abuse and powerlessness, we need someone to be some sort of responsible overseer who can be held accountable or who can at least facilitate resources for children in these social environments. In online social spaces, I think that's probably going to be either the corporations that are hosting these social environments or potentially the government. Of stepping in and saying, we need to make sure there's some minimum safety standards. We need to make sure there's some minimum of how people can report abuse. And if we're going to deal with this issue of powerlessness in the online social spaces, we have to have a way for minors and kids to have someone to reach out to in these online social spaces. All right, so I'm going to wrap up because I want some time for discussion. But essentially what I'm looking at is the way our online social spaces are vulnerable to forces of oppression. And I'm especially worried about this because I think oppression is functioning in distinct and novel ways in online social environments when compared to offline social environments. So I've tried to give you 3 examples that hopefully convince you of that. One, looking at gendered marginalization and arguing that we've moved from just sort of exclusion to complete erasure of this issue in online spaces. And so we need to be telling the truth about that. Talked about cultural imperialism and hate speech, and that we're faced with this sort of radical passivity where the hosts and monitors of online social spaces are refusing to set basic speech norms and behavioral norms, and we need to push for those norms to be established. And then talking about children and powerlessness, that there's no one that's in sort of a guardianship role in online social spaces, and we need to establish that. So if we want to intervene in these forces of oppression in online social environments, we're going to need to think about these differences and probably develop new tools and new interventions to combat their harm in our online social spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk, Kate. And again, my apologies for having trouble getting in. Anyone have questions? If you do, please raise your hand. AG, you've got your hand up.
Yes, great. Thank you for this. This is really cool. I'm curious what you think about the role of algorithms in guiding our experience in online spaces. I was thinking, especially towards the end when you were talking about children and the kind of digital latchkey kids that unguided. My guess is that a lot of companies' impulses would be to say, oh, sure, we'll develop a new tool and it will be this new algorithm that will protect them and will delete hate speech as soon as it's submitted. And I mean, but we already see all sorts of issues with this not happening. And so I'm just kind of wondering if you think that that's the way to go, or if it would be better to focus on kind of the user experience or the input on the user side to try and straighten things out.
Yeah, great question. I think the short answer is it's one possible way to go. I mean, I do think we need less hate speech online, right? Again, if you went to pick up your kid from an elementary school and there was like hate speech on posters all over the hallways and they were like, well, we didn't put those up, you would be like, I don't care. You need to deal with it. I think that's one way to go. Certainly algorithms can be very helpful, although we've also seen how they got us into this mess in the first place, right? So I think the real problem is not necessarily which algorithms we use, but kind of the approach that people take to this topic. And so, like I said, I'm really worried by this real passivity and this lack of responsibility of like, I can't be responsible for anything that's hosted here. I can't be responsible for this. And I think, honestly, that's why I mentioned government intervention, because I'm a little pessimistic of whether we can even get tech companies to want to take that kind of responsibility. So maybe if they can do algorithms, that would be great. I'm just more worried of, can we get them to like care about the right things is I think the harder step. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay.
Great. Dave, you're next in line.
So I'm curious, maybe before we get to like the FBI going through Twitter's user records, do you think dealing with the anonymity is going to help a little, at least, like maybe something like verified accounts?
Great question. I think it could help a little, but I don't think it's going to be like a silver bullet. So when we look at stuff like the scale of women receiving like threats and abuse online, not all of that is from anonymous accounts, right? And we look at hate speech and hate speech groups on Facebook that are recruiting. Those are not anonymous accounts. So I really think there's some psychology that like this could cut down on some of the phenomena. But I think the real problem is a lack of willingness to say, here's our speech norms for being in this social environment. If you're in this social environment, you have to follow these speech norms. And it doesn't matter if you're anonymous or not, you still have to follow them. And so I think if we got rid of anonymity, that could get us part of the way there, but I don't think it's going to fully resolve the issue. Does that make sense? Great. Yeah.
Okay. Good question. Ashley, you are next in the queue.
Thanks. Thanks, Kate. I thought that was really, really thought-provoking and like obviously a super important topic. I guess one thing that I'm kind of curious to hear how you're like thinking about or thinking through is in when you're talking about sort of the passivity, like your example of the cop who's like, what's Twitter? Why do I care? Like, kind of this sort of thing, right? Is thinking about like maybe the ways in which like we, at least sort of in traditionally American law, are thinking about like what's necessary to like actually constitute a threat. And so I'm sort of reminded of like, if you're familiar with the like Supreme Court case involving the guy who was posting these what I consider to be very clear threats, right, against his ex, right, whose sort of conviction is thrown out because they're not they don't meet, right, whatever the sort of like criminal specific requirement, right, as it's sort of being directed in a certain way. And it seems like there's some way in which that's what's kind of going on with sort of hate speech online, is that we're sort of like not recognizing the ways in which it actually is threatening and does cause like actual fear, even when it's not maybe as specifically tailored as sort of like traditional criminal threat or law that deals with like criminal threats would demand. And so like maybe if part of it is thinking about like sort of reconceptualizing what kind of language actually is threatening in these sort of new environments, right? Because I do think there's something about threats that is contextual to the environment that we're in.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I think absolutely that's it. That's a key part of the topic here. I like Young's analysis of let's focus on agency. And so one thing we could look at is, well, do women behave differently online in order to avoid threats? Does this function to restrict their actions? And the answer is yes. Many women go online less often or try to post different things because they're concerned about this. I also think this is one way that oppression online is very familiar and very much the same as oppression in real life, which is like whose perspective matters when determining whether it's a threat or not. And what we see is more often this sympathy for, well, we could understand how it could be a man blowing off steam, and so the intent isn't threatening. rather than centering on there's a woman who is very badly scared by this and viewed it as a genuine threat. And so that makes it a genuine threat, regardless of what the intent was. So I think that's absolutely right. And I don't know how we switch our expectations around that. But I think that's absolutely right, that we have to look at, and you can look at that, especially, I get really concerned with the data on kids, like minors that are experiencing like sexual harassment and sexual threats before they turn 18. And that kind of stuff can stick with you and have a really lasting impact on how you experience all of your later relationships. And it doesn't really matter that it happened online instead of face-to-face. It can still be super damaging. So all that is to say, yes, I think you're right. A lot of it is about how do we conceptualize what counts as damaging, what counts as a threat in those social spaces.
Thanks.
Great, and we've got about 3 more minutes left for Q&A, and Jen has her hand up.
Cool, thank you. Yeah. Oh, Kate, this is so interesting and simultaneously like so terrifying, right?
Yeah.
But I was reminded in your response to Ashley of Kate Mann's work, right, and her discussion of empathy, right? Mm-hmm. And I was just like, yeah, like that's what it is. Sorry, I'm just thinking. But what I wanted to ask about was the concept of erasure that you bring up, because I think it's a real, like, I like that way of thinking about going further than marginalization. But then I was wondering if you're thinking about erasure in 2 senses, right? So one sense of erasure being like the erasure of the problem, right? Where we do this thing where we're like, well, it happens to everybody and like, blah, 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 right? Or like whatever. And we do that thing, right, that people do, which is kind of the empathy thing / the like, all God's children's got problems thing. But then I was thinking about erasure in this other kind of sense, which is like the actual erasure of minoritized groups from online spaces, right? So through tweets being scrubbed, right, or siloed, this kind of thing. And then it felt more familiar to me, right? So the idea of the erasure of entire cultures, right, sort of via cultural imperialism, right, or the erasure of people from history, right, sort of through scrubbing records and things like that. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about these senses of erasure that you're thinking about and the uniqueness of online erasure.
Great, fantastic. Thanks for that question. And thank you all for your questions. This is really helpful. I'm just getting started on this project. And I'll be honest, I debated between a stronger thesis and a more moderate thesis. And my moderate thesis was just going to be oppression is worse online. Right. And then the stronger thesis is oppression is novel online. And I was like, well, I should just go for it. And I'm not sure if I totally made it or not. And erasure is one of these key points. So, okay. I think you're absolutely right. There's good evidence of people just like being taken offline. And I think that's one of the problems with cultural imperialism of if we say we're going to be neutral and not intervene at all, what that essentially means is a decision that it won't be a public space for some. Right? We're going to always default to our dominant culture. And then you also mentioned kind of erasure as like underselling or gaslighting, as like not big a deal. I think I actually meant it in a third way, which is kind of just trying to define out a problem. So if you go to a law enforcement authority and you say like, look, is sexual abuse and oppression on the internet a problem? And they say no. It's this case of like the Slate writer goes in with like, here's these words that someone says to me, and they literally look at it and go, that's not a police problem. That's a you shouldn't go on Twitter problem. Or that's not sexual abuse and harassment. That's just people blowing off steam on the internet. Right. So it's literally trying to say this example that you have in front of me is not in this category, is not this type of problem. And so then you say there's not a problem with gender on the internet, or there's not a problem with sexual threats, or I think of just straight up defining like this isn't that as a way to completely avoid the problem. And so I think this is more problematic because then for the victims, kind of what do you say? like no, this is a threat. These words do mean that it's a threat. Like it puts them in a very difficult position of there's not even grounds to kind of come back or make an argument if you're sort of told, this is not that thing, this is not our area of concern. Does that make sense? But that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah,
sorry, lots of great questions and lots of great discussions. I just want to make sure that our next speakers have the full amount of time. Again, let's thank Kate and everyone for their participation. Now we will move on to Jacob Warren and A.G. Haldier. They're from the University of Arkansas. And the title of their talk is Malpractice on Human Souls, the Violence of Fake News.
Great, thanks. So yeah, this is, clearly a co-authored paper. And so I'm gonna be, rather than us trying to bounce back and forth between anything, I'll just be kind of delivering the main talk, and then we'll both be here to field questions, but be sure to direct all your really hard questions to Jacob. So, all right. So yeah, so we're talking about fake news, and it's uncontroversial to hold that fake news undermines the goals of epistemic communities. But in this paper, we are arguing for a stronger claim that fake news is a form of violence, insofar as it corrupts not only the epistemic, but the moral character of its audience. Moreover, we think that the professional obligations of the media entail that neglecting one's duty to avoid this violence and perpetuating this violence is a form of journalistic malpractice, as well as a form of what Johan Galtung calls cultural violence. So we begin in section 1 first by motivating our discussion of fake news through several examples and offering a working definition of the category, as well as focusing on how it transmits what Jason Stanley has called a flawed ideology. Then we'll move on and explain flawed ideologies a little more specifically and try to highlight how their propagation and their associated consequences amount to violence. And then we'll wrap up. So consider the following two cases. In 2005, then CNN anchor Lou Dobbs reported that the US had suffered over 7,000 cases of leprosy in the previous 3 years. And he attributed this startling increase to an invasion of illegal immigrants, quote. Actually, Dobbs's calculations were incorrect. The US had seen roughly that many leprosy cases over the previous 3 decades. But Dobbs stubbornly refused to issue a retraction with updated numbers, instead insisting, quote, "If we reported it, it's a fact." In 2020, here's case number 2, then Fox News anchor Lou Dobbs reported that the results of the 2020 election were, quote, "eerily reminiscent of what happened with Smartmatic software electronically changing votes in the 2013 presidential election in Venezuela," end quote. In the weeks following Joe Biden's presidential victory, Dobbs repeatedly raised questions and amplified conspiracy theories about Donald Trump's loss, granting guests like Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani considerable airtime to spread misinformation about electoral security. Now, both of these stories demonstrate different kinds of journalistic negligence. The former straightforwardly concerns the accuracy of the information transmitted by a journalist reporting a news story. Dobbs's assertion about leprosy rates and his concomitant xenophobia was simply wrong, and he was unwilling to set the record straight. The latter case is more complicated. When Dobbs invites guests to speculate about potentially slanderous untruths, he's not necessarily reporting misinformation about the election. In fact, it's not clear that he, as opposed to Powell or Giuliani, is asserting anything at all. But by prompting his guests with leading questions and granting them public attention to spread misinformation, Dobbs's program becomes a conduit for conspiracies that are often no match for conflicting information. Now, in the burgeoning literature on fake news, 2 distinct definitions have emerged. Though both camps recognize that fake news spreads misinformation, the wider perspective treats fake news as reporting that is either intentionally or potentially misleading, while the more narrow one restricts fake news specifically only to news articles that are intentionally or verifiably false. Because we are interested primarily in the pernicious effects of fake news rather than in questions of its intentionality, we're going to adopt the more pragmatic wide definition originated by Mukherjee and defended by several others that sees fake news as, quote, bullshit asserted in the form of a news publication. Now, famously, Harry Frankfurt explained how bullshit is a curious kind of speech act, where a speaker is unconnected to a concern with truth. Fake news then might or might not contain accurate information, but the journalist reporting the story is, on some level, indifferent to how things really are, and is instead motivated by any number of non-alethic concerns. The motivations disconnected from truthfulness for amplifying fake news can take multiple forms. While fake news is frequently created and spread for straightforwardly profit-driven reasons, it is often the case that viewers and internet users with no financial stake in a given fake news story will contribute to that story's propagation. Consider, for example, the 156 fake news stories tracked by Alcott and Jensko in the weeks leading up to the 2016 election that were shared nearly 40 million times by users on Facebook. It seems eminently reasonable to assume that a significant subset of these users were spreading this misinformation, as it were, for free, as opposed to the for-profit virality mills geared towards encouraging such engagement. In some cases, amateur fake news spreaders might do so because they believe the fake news stories in question. But Pennycook and Rand demonstrate how only a minority of users evince consistent, reflected upon belief in the stories that they share. Instead, it looks like users are generally simply inattentively sharing misinformation that they mistakenly believe to be true. Furthermore, structural features in the attentional economy of the internet, such as likes, shares, comments, clicks, that sort of thing, encourage people to unreflectively propagate internet content. If that content is importantly bullshit in the first place, then the problem of fake news is seemingly intertwined with fundamentally unconscious, or at least unreflective, psychological mechanisms that are being fed inputs disconnected from concerns for the truth in the first place. So let's call the Dobbs report on leprosy sick, and the Dobbs report on the 2020 election soft, as in software. In an ideal setting, we should expect journalistic stories to be reasonable, evidentially supported, and importantly true. In this way, both sick and soft are problematic, insofar as neither one is founded on a true assertion of public interest. In the interest of charity, we might assume that Dobbs and his team believed that sick was true when they initially reported it, but their failure, and indeed Dobbs's explicit unwillingness to issue a later correction when it became clear that they had made an error, reveals an overall lack of concern for the truth of the story being reported. That is to say, sick is Frankfurtian bullshit, and therefore qualifies as fake news. In a different way, soft is also fake news, because the assertions made during a segment of a news program, whether by Dobbs himself or by one of his guests, are left standing unchallenged when the program ends. Though the mechanisms by which these concerning propositions are added to the public record are more convoluted, the program as a whole might be said to be asserting Frankfurtian bullshit. Therefore, the program is a source of fake news. This problem is not merely fake news' contribution to the spread of misinformation or bullshit throughout a community. Whereas a bullshitter might not care about the truth value of the simple propositions they add to the public record, they nevertheless care about something. That is to say, journalists like Dobbs, who publish stories like Sick and Soft, are motivated to do so. And it might be the case that Dobbs personally believes the assertions bound up within Sick and Soft, even after being presented with evidence to the contrary. But it might also be the case that Dobbs is simply seeking attention or publicity for his program. And if a large enough segment of Dobbs's audience believe the core propositions of Sick or Soft, then Dobbs would still have a non-truth-based reason to report them. So in this way, we might think of fake news as being importantly motivated by various kinds of ideologies that can ultimately drive derivative concerns, such as ratings or profits based on viewers allied to those ideologies. Swanson defines ideologies as clusters of mutually supporting beliefs, interests, norms, practices, values, affective dispositions, and ways of interpreting and interacting with the world that importantly shape how a person committed to an ideology understands reality. To this list of abstracta, Kukla adds material components such as buildings, aesthetic products, street signs, spatial divisions such as gates and hedges and the like that serve to reinforce and therefore recapitulate the conditions from which an ideology will grow. Altogether, we might think, with Althusser, of ideology as individuals' imaginary relation to their real conditions of existence that manifest in ways material, behavioral, and doxastic. Importantly, ideologies are not necessarily false, nor are they necessarily damaging or self-destructive. But any ideology that can systematically rob groups of knowledge of their own mental states by systematically concealing their interests from them will be, following Stanley, importantly flawed. By undermining the foundations upon which an individual, among other things, maintains their status as a rational agent, flawed ideologies provoke people into forming false and often damaging beliefs about other people, the world, and themselves. However, because this happens ideologically via a method that is paradigmatically subtle and unnoticeable, insofar as it relies upon presuppositions and other unstated assumptions, these corrupt beliefs, what Stanley calls flawed ideological beliefs, might similarly go unnoticed. Consider again the case of Sick. While the overt false content expressed by this report was that immigrants were spreading leprosy throughout the United States, the report also relies upon, and thereby interpolates, a blatantly xenophobic ideology. In a similar way, Soft, simply via its broadcasting, maintains a straightforwardly anti-democratic ideology within the epistemic community affected by Dobbs's program. And this is importantly true, regardless of who is making the questionable assertions about Smartmatic's machines, or even if Dobbs or someone else is just asking questions during the show. It might well be the case that one reason why subjects with greater familiarity of news media processes, of the sort taught under the heading of critical media literacy, are less apt to form false beliefs in response to news stories is precisely because they are more consciously attuned to the kinds of ideological mechanisms that often function in subconscious ways. So in sum, Sick and Soft are not only both examples of fake news, but they both function as vehicles for flawed ideologies that undermine the epistemic functioning of those uncritically exposed to such stories. Now we'll move on and demonstrate how this undermining constitutes not only a non-ideal epistemic environment, but violence upon those exposed to it. So according to Galtung, cultural violence is any aspect of the symbolic sphere of our existence, exemplified by language and art, that can be used to justify or legitimize structural violence. Structural violence manifests itself as social conditions that trap people in poverty, disease, discrimination, degradation, enslavement, or abuse. So as fake news infects our cultural, social, and epistemic processes, it enacts cultural violence on those who receive and engage with it, restricting their autonomy and knowledge, and perpetuating itself through virality and social media. Fake news' proclivity for proliferation is reflective of the way that it is created, interacted with, and understood. So the Russian philosopher, semiotician, and linguist Mikhail Bakhtin, in an attempt to understand the way that dialogue interacts with the agency of those who participate in such dialogue, imagined the interactions as what he called centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centripetal forces push meaning and understanding into a solitary and monolithic structure that allows for an easier top-down transmission from creators to the masses. Whereas centrifugal forces spiral outside this top-down structure, allowing for all sorts of different interpretations and understandings. Fake news is so pervasive because it infects both of these forces. Consider again the Lou Dobbs example. In both Sick and Soft, Dobbs employs a transmission model of communication akin to Bakhtin's centripetal force, insofar as a message is sent by Dobbs and his production crew and received by his audience. Meaning is made, or is at least presumed to be made, by the audience. And I mean, this part is not exactly a novel idea, but simply reflects the way that news has been done since printing presses allowed for the onset of op-eds. But Bakhtin's centrifugal force, the wild, uncontrolled discursive field of the people, has grown more powerful than even his prescient imagination could have predicted, thanks to the growth of the internet and social media. As viewers and readers, those with follower sizes both large and small of fake news, apply centrifugal forces to their understanding, they make and remake new meanings, and through their own digital avenues, social media feeds, YouTube channels, etc., fling them out into their own information ecosystems. While they certainly depend on the transmission of the original fake news to initiate the misinformation, it is their own agency and their own interpretations and selections of sound bites, clips, and various outrages that drive the virality of their centrifugal forces. It is their dialogue with, to extend the example, Dobbs's dialogue, that ultimately becomes the most powerful and subjective. They are, in essence, willful super spreaders of misinformation and cultural violence. These super spreaders act as combustive agents to trigger the self-inflating dynamic of fake news that, by sparking outrage, creates traction on social media, thereby creating more victims and eventually more news. A Lou Dobbs guest casually claiming election fraud in December paves the way for an attempted coup a mere month later in January, underscoring how quickly these super spreaders can manifest their violence. In this way, the violence of media malpractice begets more and more kinds of violence. The original intent of the broadcast, article, post, or video is nearly irrelevant. As long as clicks and views are generated, as long as shares foster more shares, as long as outrage generates more outrage, the structure initiating the cultural violence is satisfied. Rather, the interpretation of the fake news is what creates the beliefs that spawn more beliefs, or interpolates ideologies that can slowly alter an audience member's perspective in all manners of dangerous ways. That is to say, the ideological underbelly of fake news, spread through both centrifugal and centripetal forces, serves to validate and perhaps even to change the broader worldviews of those watching. If fake news motivates an audience member to form flawed ideological beliefs as described, then it, quote, influences them so that their actual somatic and mental realizations are below their potential realizations, end quote. This is precisely Galtung's definition of violence. By shrouding fake news in identity-grounding ideologies, those who create and share these posts encourage a sense of self-actualization within individuals while actually driving them further into a corrupt kind of dependency. Counterfactually, without the influence of fake news, it might well be the case that many people would not doxastically commit themselves to the positions they actually do. And they certainly would not perpetuate the same kinds of physical violence as a consequence. So these beliefs are not only examples of Stanley's flawed ideological beliefs, but they are violence towards those who internalize and believe them, as well as those people that are later subjected to new manifestations of the beliefs. Ultimately, for fake news to take root in an audience, all that's really needed is the fertile soil of pre-existing biases and a trusted delivery system. The top-down creation of fake news through media superstructures that are later internalized and recreated in the image of the new creator is precisely such a system. So fake news not only manifests violence on an individual level, but on a cultural level as well. And the effects of fake news are not limited to a single audience member. The shareable nature of modern media empowers recipients to place any story on a path of virality, turning viewers from passive receptors of information to willful super spreaders of conspiracy theories. As Marwick notes, whether people are likely to trust a story has less to do with who published it than who shared it. Many fake news stories reinforce narratives about race, class, and gender that help build and reinforce collective identity. Sharing posts that are products of fake news is an act of cultural violence, one that perpetuates and buttresses the structural violence of discrimination and hatred of others, and the ongoing mental subjugation of themselves. Currently, the cultural violence of fake news and its super spreader phenomenon is only limited by the reach of a given share button. Bakhtin's centrifugal forces would always be capable of flinging some dangerous new meaning outwards to influence others. Yet those forces are still inherently dependent on the centripetal forces of the top-down transmission. Altogether, fake news created and distributed by those such as Lou Dobbs is a form of violence enacted upon the recipients of the transmissions, delimiting their potential by infecting them with flawed ideological beliefs as they become more and more ensconced in their world of fake news. Their cognitive faculties and autonomy are tied to the interpretation of the next message. They are restricted. And as those recipients respond to their experiences of violence in their own ways, they easily recapitulate that violence to others in their own networks, eventually manifesting and supporting more robust institutions of structural or cultural violence. So what then should we say about the originators of fake news? While they may create their Frankfurtian bullshit for any number of reasons, all that matters for our present concern is the harmful effects that their work has on others. By restricting the mental autonomy of their audience and feeding them a toxic diet of ideology, which also typically happens to abound with hurtful and hateful beliefs about others, the people responsible for creating fake news are severely violating reasonable expectations for journalistic ethics. But because the centripetally delivered fake news can centrifugally spiral throughout the socio-epistemic environment as consumers reinterpret and spread the poison of misinformation, this journalistic malpractice is akin to the releasing of a virus into an immunocompromised unit. It is a dangerous, irresponsible act that is at best a shameful oversight and at worst a grave sin. Either way, fake news is violence. In his novel, The Virginian, A Horseman of the Plains, Owen Wister relates a conversation between the title character and the unnamed narrator about how powerful people, because of their social station, are often able to convince others to follow along a path of belief and behavior. The risk of such charisma is clear, as we have seen time and again in our own non-fictional experience. Wister's narrator insists that there should in truth be heavy damages for malpractice on human souls. We agree. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, AG. If anybody has questions, please raise your hand. Okay, I see Paula has her hand up, and then Dave is next in the queue.
Thanks so much for your talk, Jacob and AG. That was fantastic. My last presidential address dealt with mind viruses as a result of fake news. And so I really appreciated what you all had to say. My big problem with the spreading of the mind viruses is, how do you control this? Do you all have some inoculation, a vaccine for the spreading of this fake news? Some suggestions about how we ought to go about controlling this sort of spread that is so indeed dangerous and violent.
What do you think, Jacob? You want to take that one?
Yeah, I think it's similar to when people talk about carbon emissions, and they say, we as individuals, what we can do is we can run our dishwasher less or have less air conditioning, something like that. When in reality, something like 75% of the emissions come from massive corporations, right? So it's really difficult for us as individuals to counteract this, because what we're going up against are some of the largest media corporations in the entire world. So I think that the onus has to be placed on people like Facebook, people like Twitter, and we have to do a better job of policing what our media operations are actually allowing in terms of, I don't know, Facebook tried to, towards the end of the 2020 election cycle, try to kind of tamp down on misinformation and do a better job of policing this stuff. But in reality, their entire profit structure is based on who's engaging with these posts. So until we fix something like that, it is really, really difficult to sit here and imagine how individuals can really solve the problem. I don't mean that to sound desolate, but that's kind of where I've landed on the whole thing. AG, are you with me on that?
Yeah. I mean, just like I think Kate was saying towards the end of her presentation as well, there is something to be said for like a virtue-based argument, like for individuals to develop skills in critical media literacy, teaching things like this in schools. Yes, that's good. But ultimately, we need something like government regulation of a much stronger order than what we are currently seeing.
Guys, interesting stuff.
Thanks for your question, Paul. So we've got about 10 more minutes for questions. Dave is next, then Kate and Ashley.
So I totally agree with QAnon. QAnon is definitely bullshit, right? Because the guy who was spreading that stuff basically after January 6th went online and was like, sorry guys, think about all the fun we had along the way, but sign up for my Patreon, right? So I mean, it's pretty clearly like, but I'm not sure I'm willing to grant that for some of the Stop the Steal. Like some of that seems genuinely earnest to me. So I'm curious if in cases where people are like genuinely convinced, right? They're sitting there online and they're like, look, there's a spike, 100,000 Biden votes just came in, it's a conspiracy, like, and they really believe it. Does that change the things when it's not just like casual irresponsibility, or do you see it the same?
I could say first that I think what you're describing is kind of highlighting the severity of the problem, really. Is that on one level, yeah, I want to, I mean, maybe if we were going to be talking about what sorts of punishments or consequences or something, if we were going to have that conversation, we might want to make some more fine-grained distinctions. But the fact that people can like otherwise well-intentioned, rational people can come to hold such wildly incorrect and irresponsible beliefs is precisely the problem. And so the resulting, like the effects being the same in both cases is, I think, going to require a very similar sort of judgment then. Even if maybe punishment judgments, that might be a different conversation.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. Kate, you've got your hand up.
Great, thank you for the talk. I have a related question about the role of personal habits and responsibilities with this. I'm wondering what you think individuals can do. I have two kind of guesses. One would be we could cultivate habits of like not sharing, as you say, and like not sharing stuff that we're suspicious of. But I also wondered about your definition of bullshit and whether we should cultivate like virtues of caring a lot more about accuracy, and if that could try to counteract some of these things. Yeah, so just wondering to what extent could individual habits have any sort of impact here?
You want to go?
Well, I'll take the first one, AG. The bullshit is more your territory. So I think that I mean that very kindly. But some social media platforms, I'm thinking specifically of Twitter here. There's been kind of a groundswell of saying that instead of retweeting something that is pernicious and clearly bullshit, instead, you should, if you want to engage with it, the easiest way is to do something like screenshot it and then post it in your own domain. That way you kind of, you tamp down on the algorithm just a little bit. But I think that all we can really do is ramp up our critical media literacy for the next generation and really try and start instilling that in our secondary schools as soon as possible, because this is not going away and we're just going to become more and more inundated with it. And so we've really got to do a better job. And I say this as someone who worked in high school education for years. We've got to be better about teaching our students who's creating these things, why are they creating them, where's the funding coming from, and what's motivating this. And so hopefully, as we get further down the road and this becomes more and more part of the quotidian, we'll have discerning parties. And AG, bullshit away.
Well, yeah, I actually think what you said would take care of a lot of the bullshit issues as well. I mean, because as people are paying more attention to what they're reading, not necessarily, I don't want to say cultivating an attitude of suspicion necessarily, like that's not necessarily the attitude, but sensitivity to truth, then I think you're also like kind of going to be developing a sensitivity for things that are insensitive to truth as well. And so I think you'll kind of fix some of the bullshit issues. But that being said, I still think that structural regulation of the technological parties are going to be best. And like we see this with Twitter, they've relatively recently, they've implemented a design change where if you go to retweet or share a story that you haven't clicked on and read, it will at least sometimes ask you if you're sure. Do you want to read the story before you share it? And you can still share it. It's just this little tiny extra nudge. You have to hit an extra button. I think those sorts of even relatively small structural changes are, I mean, at least really helpful, maybe even necessary. But maybe I'm just too pessimistic.
So we've got about 4 more minutes for questions. It's Ashley and then Jeff.
Awesome, thank you. This is super interesting, and I guess one thing I'm sort of curious about in thinking about how we're trying to encourage, for instance, social media companies, whether it's, I don't know, whatever Facebook just changed their name to, or whatever, to sort of regulate some of this stuff is I guess just like I'm a little bit worried about what sort of standard we might be using to gauge, whether or not, right, this sort of story is sort of fake or something like that, right? Because it does seem like, at least sort of past history should suggest to us that things that would have been, deplatformed as sort of fake news or untrue actually sort of, subsequently might have turned out to be otherwise. And so, not that I'm think that QAnon or a lot of these really have anything to it, but right, just I guess my sort of fear that something like that might actually happen, because so much of what we accept as true actually seems to be based, right, in sort of trust. So how are you thinking through what, or what how do we understand that standard or deal with those kind of concerns?
Well, I don't know if you read, so you mentioned the new Facebook, or somebody did the Meta or whatever they're calling themselves. But in one of the reportings on that, there was this example where someone who was doing an independent audit of Facebook created a fictional account of a white conservative woman from South Carolina. And with only liking basic conservative soccer momish principles, within 3 or 4 days, she was being directed towards fringe conspiracy theory groups on the right. And so it is really difficult, but it's hard to say that Facebook or Twitter or whomever should be the arbiter of truth, but currently they are arbiters of untruth, right? And so what we can do is encourage them in whatever regulatory way to tamp down on that algorithm and to stop them from cornering people into these areas where they can be flung into the bullshit and be flung into untruth. AG, you got anything?
No, I think this is a huge question, a hugely important question. And I see Kate nodding. I think she's probably with what I'm about to say too, that I feel like right now the problem is that, at least on an institutional level, nothing's really being done. So I feel like this is, I feel like we're in the stage of more like the canary in the coal mine or something. That's probably not the right analogy of saying, hey, we need to pay attention to this. But then your question is kind of the important next step of saying, okay, once we kind of stop directing random people to believe that ghosts are infecting their blood in vaccines or something, then what's the right standard? What will we replace that with? I mean, that has to be part of the conversation at some point, and some point soon, if it's going to be really an effective kind of conversation ultimately. But at this point, I'm
just want to make sure we get to Jen's question.
Okay.
At the top.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yep.
All right. So yeah, Jen is trying to put her hand down. But yeah, so it is 11:30 Central Time, and we're about to have the executive committee meeting in here. So we're going to shut this down and do the recording, but I want to thank our presenters, great talks, and thank you for Leonard to step up and be our chair. I hope you'll stick around for the presidential address, which might touch on some of these issues in some way. We'll see. And but next up, it's lunchtime. If you want to go over to Zoom meeting room 1 and hang out and eat, that's fine. We're gonna close this down and then have our executive committee meeting here. So thanks everyone. We'll see you back at whenever we get started back here. So thanks everyone.
You're going to close it down and then you want us to come back in?
Yeah. So that way
Okay.
I can